remember this like it was yesterday, Halloween night 2 years ago. The memory still gives me the shivers. You see, I live in a quiet neighbourhood where everyone knows each other. I'm a fairly typical teenager who says hello to people on the way to and from school, exchanging pleasantries with familiar faces. Mrs. Kelly, an elderly woman who lived at the end of the street, was one such person. She always asked how I was doing, and we struck up a conversation one day when she saw me carrying my violin to school for lessons. But that night, as I walked home from school, something strange happened. The sun had set, casting an eerie darkness over the neighbourhood. The streetlights flickered and the air was filled with a chilling silence. I was about halfway home when I heard Mrs. Kelly through her front door, her voice piercing through the night, screaming for help. Fear coursed through my veins, not knowing what to do. My house was less than a minute away, so I hurriedly made my way to our house, my heart pounding. Bursting through the front door, I found my parents in the living room, their faces reflecting my panic. Breathlessly, I told them about Mrs. Kelly's distress, her cries for help echoing in my mind. But as I mentioned her name and described her house, my parents exchanged confused glances. "That house has been empty for years," my dad finally said. Confusion washed over me. How could that be? I'd spoken to her just that morning. My parents, sensing my distress, decided to accompany me back to Mrs. Kelly's house, hoping to alleviate my concerns. Walking together in the darkness, we arrived at the familiar address, but when we reached the house, an icy chill ran down my spine. The windows were shattered, the paint peeled, and the front yard was overrun with weeds. It looked like nobody had lived there for years. My dad sighed and explained that the house had been vacant ever since a gruesome murder case involving its previous owner. The details were grim and haunting, and the tragedy had left an indelible mark on the neighbourhood. To this day, whenever I pass by Mrs. Kelly's house, I still get goosebumps. I don't disbelieve what my dad told me, but I had actual conversations with her, and for a while the whole thing made me constantly question and doubt myself. But I do know that I never saw Mrs. Kelly again, or anybody else in that house. It was Halloween night, and a group of us had gathered at Emily's house for a spooky celebration. The air was filled with excitement as we donned our costumes, ready to immerse ourselves in the festive spirit. Little did we know that this night would take a terrifying turn. As the party went on, we were completely engrossed in our own little world of Halloween festivities, blasting music and checking out all the costumes. That's when Emily's phone buzzed, pulling her attention away from the fun. She furrowed her brow as she read the text from her parents. There had been a burglary at her house. The news sent a wave of unease through the room. We huddled together, exchanging worried looks. Just then, a knock on the door startled us. Opening it, we found 2 police officers standing outside, their expressions grave. They informed us that there'd been a series of violent incidents following a string of burglaries in the area. As a precaution, they requested that everyone return to their homes and stay safe. Disappointment mingled with a growing nervousness as we bid each other farewell and started to make our way home. Walking through the dimly lit streets, the atmosphere had changed. The once jubilant mood was now replaced by a lingering sense of tension. I couldn't help but feel a prickle of discomfort as I noticed a black car parked at the end of the path that led to my house. Something felt wrong, and an instinctual fear gnawed at my gut. I paused for what seemed ages, but decided to take an alternative route home, avoiding the ominous car. As I turned to leave, 2 men suddenly burst out of the vehicle, their faces covered by masks, and they were holding weapons of some sort, metal bars or hammers. Fear gripped me as adrenaline surged through my veins. Without hesitation, I broke into a sprint, my footsteps echoing in the night. Their heavy breathing followed close behind, adding to the harrowing chase. Panic fueled every step as I ran for my life. I wasn't far from my house, and with a surge of determination, I pushed myself harder, urging my legs to move faster. The familiar sight of my front door came into view, bringing instant relief. I fumbled with the keys, praying they would fit into the lock. Once inside, I slammed the door shut and locked it, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I peered through the window, expecting to see the pursuers closing in on me, but to my immense relief, there was no one in sight. With trembling hands, I relayed the terrifying event to my parents, their faces pale with concern. We wasted no time in dialing the police, describing the car and the men who had chased me. The police assured us that they would dispatch officers to investigate. Later that night, news spread like wildfire. 2 men matching the description were apprehended, their arrest bringing an end to the fear and panic. As the days passed, the intensity of that night began to fade, but the memory of those terrifying moments always creeped back at Halloween. This happened about 4 or 5 years ago. It was Halloween night and I was out trick-or-treating with my friends. We were having a blast, going from house to house, getting candy and scaring each other with spooky stories. As we walked down the street towards the next house, I noticed a man standing out on the front porch, dressed in a suit and tie. "Trick or treat," I shouted, holding out my bag. The man smiled and dropped in a bunch of candy. "Happy Halloween," he said. As we walked away, I heard him call out to us, "Hey kids, do you want to come inside and see my Halloween decorations?" My friends and I looked at each other nervously. We knew we weren't supposed to go inside a stranger's house, but the man seemed harmless enough. We followed him inside, and he led us through a maze of spooky decorations and fake cobwebs. Suddenly, the man's phone rang, and he excused himself to take the call. As soon as he left the room, my friends and I bolted for the door. We ran down the street as fast as we could, laughing and screaming in relief. A couple of weeks later, we had pretty much forgotten about that night, but one day we were having a sports event at school, where parents were allowed to come and spectate. I was sitting with my friends outside watching a netball game, when my friend Chloe pointed at the crowd of parents and said, "Look, it's the guy from Halloween." We looked round and it was the man. He was staring right at us. At first we didn't know what to do. We were scared, but we didn't want to get into any trouble. We decided to tell our principal, who called the police, but when we looked again for the man, he was gone. We gave a description to the police, and obviously we had his address from when we were trick-or-treating. He was tracked down later that same day, and turned out to be wanted in another state for stalking and assault charges. He was obviously using Halloween as a cover to lure kids into his home. The man was arrested and jailed, but the memory of that Halloween night still haunts me. I can't believe we were all so naive and trusting. I just thank God that we thought to make a run for it when we did.